Imagine a dragonfly with a wingspan wider than a golden retriever is long. Imagine a millipede the size of a car tire coiling through a forest so dense and ancient, it makes a rainforest look like a garden. Imagine standing at the edge of a swamp 300 million years ago and watching something with 8 legs and the body mass of a medium-sized dog drag a small amphibian into the shadows. This was not a nightmare. This was Tuesday. For millions upon millions of years, insects ruled this planet in a way that no creature before or since has ever matched. Not in size, not in dominance, not in sheer biological ambition. The Carboniferous Period, roughly 359 million to 299 million years ago, was the age of the giant bug. And the giants that lived then were not gentle. They were not rare. They were everywhere. The creature that has come to define this era in the popular imagination is Meganeura, a dragonfly. But calling Meganeura a dragonfly is like calling a great white shark a goldfish. Its wingspan reached 70 centimeters, nearly 2.5 feet from wingtip to wingtip. It weighed more than a sparrow. It flew through skies that had never seen a bird, hunting with compound eyes the size of ping-pong balls, locking onto prey with a precision that modern fighter jet targeting systems would envy. But Meganeura was not even the largest thing crawling, flying, or slithering through those carboniferous forests. That title belonged to Arthropleura, a millipede. 2.5 meters long, the width of a grown man's shoulders, moving through the undergrowth on hundreds of legs, leaving trackways in the mud that paleontologists would find perfectly preserved 290 million years later in a Scottish quarry and stare at in silence for a long moment before writing anything down. So what happened? Where did they go? Why did evolution build these enormous, terrifying, magnificent creatures and then take them away forever? The answer involves oxygen, catastrophe, the invention of breathing, and a planetary transformation so total that it essentially deleted an entire world and built a new one from scratch. Stay with me, because this story is stranger than anything Hollywood has ever put on screen. To understand why insects got so big, you first need to understand something that most people never think about. Insects do not breathe the way you do. They have no lungs. They have no diaphragm. They do not pull air into a central chamber and push it back out again. Instead, their bodies are threaded through with a network of tiny tubes called tracheae. These tubes branch and branch and branch again, like the roots of a tree, carrying oxygen directly to every cell in the body. No middleman, no blood carrying gases back and forth, just tubes going everywhere, delivering oxygen on contact. It is an elegant system. It is also a system with a hard biological ceiling. Here is the problem. The wider your body, the longer those tubes need to be. And the longer the tubes, the harder it becomes to move oxygen efficiently from the surface of your body to your deepest internal tissues. At some point, the tubes simply cannot do the job anymore. The oxygen runs out before it reaches the center. The insect suffocates from the inside. This is why today insects are small, not because evolution gave up on making them large, not because there was no pressure to grow, but because the atmosphere simply does not contain enough oxygen to fuel a body beyond a certain size when your respiratory system works the way an insect's does. But 300 million years ago, the atmosphere was not what it is today. Today, the air you are breathing contains roughly 21% oxygen. It feels normal. It is all you have ever known. But in the late Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen concentration climbed to somewhere between 30 and 35%. Some models suggest it may have briefly touched 35%. That is not a small difference. That is a world where every breath delivers nearly 70% more oxygen than the air outside your window right now. And that changed everything. With more oxygen flooding those tracheal tubes, the hard ceiling on insect size suddenly rose. Bodies could grow larger because the tubes could now deliver enough oxygen to tissues that would have been starved in a leaner atmosphere. The biological constraint that had kept insects small for hundreds of millions of years simply lifted. Evolution does not waste an opportunity like that. Within a few million years, a blink of an eye in geological time, insects began to scale up in ways that seem almost experimental. Almost like the planet was running trials. How big can we make this? How much can a body built on this respiratory plan actually become? The answer, it turned out, was surprisingly large. Terrifyingly large. But what caused the oxygen to spike in the first place? This is where the story gets genuinely strange, and the answer lies not in the animals, not in the insects, not in any predator or prey. It lies in the trees. The Carboniferous forests were unlike anything alive on Earth today. The dominant plants were not the flowering trees you know. They were lycopsids, giant club mosses, standing 40 meters tall. Sigillaria, lepidodendron, enormous, ancient, alien-looking things with bark like a reptile skin and crowns that filtered a sun slightly younger and slightly dimmer than the one you see today. These forests covered vast stretches of the supercontinent Pangaea. They grew, they died, they fell. And here is the critical detail. When they fell, they did not rot. The fungi and bacteria capable of breaking down lignin, the tough structural compound that makes wood hard, had not yet fully evolved. Wood was a relatively new invention in biological history. Life had only recently figured out how to build it, and life had not yet figured out how to efficiently destroy it. So when these enormous trees died and collapsed, they piled up, layer upon layer upon layer, not rotting, not decomposing, just accumulating, compressing, being buried. You know what those compressed, unrotted Carboniferous forests became? Coal. The entire coal seam underlying large parts of Europe and North America, the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution, that heated homes and smelted steel and dragged humanity into the modern age, is the compressed corpse of the Carboniferous forest. Every ton of coal pulled from the ground is a piece of that vanished world. And while those trees were alive, they were doing what all plants do. They were pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releasing oxygen. Billions upon billions of trees doing this constantly for millions of years with no decomposers efficient enough to recycle the carbon back into the air. The carbon was locked away underground. The oxygen stayed in the atmosphere and built up and built up and built up until the sky itself was different, until the world was saturated with a gas that made fires burn hotter, wounds heal faster, and insects grow to the size of house cats. This was the world Meganeura was born into. This was the world Arthropleura walked through on its hundreds of feet, leaving those enormous trackways in the ancient mud. This was a world built on a geological accident, a brief, extraordinary window when the chemistry of the atmosphere conspired to make the impossible possible. It could not last. Nothing that extreme ever does. Let us talk about Arthropleura for a moment, because this creature deserves more than a passing mention. It deserves your full attention. Picture the largest land invertebrate in the history of this planet. Not the largest insect, the largest invertebrate. Full stop. Nothing walking on land without a backbone has ever been bigger, before or since. Arthropleura was a myriapod, a relative of modern millipedes, and at its maximum recorded size, it stretched 2.5 meters from head to tail. Some fragmentary fossil evidence suggests individuals may have reached 3 meters. The width of its body at the broadest point was roughly 50 centimeters, half a meter wide. Moving on somewhere between 30 and 40 pairs of legs, each segment of its armored body overlapping the next like plates on a tank. And here is something that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Arthropleura was almost certainly a herbivore. The nightmare fuel of the Carboniferous, the creature that looks like it crawled out of a horror film produced in hell, was eating ferns. Possibly spores, possibly decaying plant matter. Its mouth parts, examined under magnification, show none of the adaptations you would expect from a predator. No crushing mandibles designed to pierce flesh, no structures built for restraining struggling prey. Just a quiet, enormous, heavily armored thing, moving through the undergrowth, eating vegetation, minding its own business, and being absolutely terrifying to look at regardless. We know it existed because of those trackways. The first Arthropleura trackways were found in the 19th century, and for decades paleontologists argued about what made them. The impressions were too wide, too regularly spaced, too numerous to match anything in the known fossil record. When body fossils finally confirmed the identity of the trackmaker, the scientific community had one of those moments that paleontology occasionally delivers. A moment where the evidence forces you to completely revise your mental image of an ancient world. The trackways have been found in Scotland, in Germany, in North America. They cross ancient floodplains. They wind through fossilized forest floors. In some locations, the impressions are so clear that individual leg placements are visible, telling researchers not just that Arthropleura was there, but how it moved, how fast it was traveling, whether it was turning or walking in a straight line. One trackway in particular, found in New Mexico and studied in detail in the 1990s, showed a creature moving in a remarkably straight line across open ground. No meandering, no hesitation. A direct path from one point to another, covering ground with a calm efficiency of something that has no natural predators and knows it. Because in the Carboniferous, Arthropleura almost certainly had none. What was going to stop it? The apex predators of the Carboniferous terrestrial environment were early amphibians and the first reptiles, creatures that were themselves only just beginning to experiment with large body sizes. A 2.5-meter armored millipede with a body like a siege engine was not on the menu for anything that existed. It was the largest animal in the room, every forest, every swamp. Now think about Meganeura sharing that same world. Meganeura monnieri, named by the French paleontologist Charles Brongniart in 1885, based on specimens found in the coal mines of Commentry in central France. Those mines were, of course, digging through Carboniferous coal, through the compressed remains of the very forests that Meganeura had flown through 310 million years earlier. There is something almost unbearably poetic about that. The fossil of the giant dragonfly, preserved inside the remains of the world it lived in. Brongniart specimens showed a wingspan of approximately 65 to 70 centimeters. Later finds confirmed this range. For comparison, The largest living dragonfly today, Petaloura ingentissima of Australia, has a wingspan of about 16 centimeters. Meganeura was more than 4 times larger. Its body alone was roughly 30 centimeters long. It had a thorax packed with flight muscles powerful enough to sustain prolonged aerial pursuit. Its compound eyes gave it near 360-degree vision. It was a hunter, a pure, dedicated, magnificently engineered aerial predator. But what was it hunting? This is where the Carboniferous ecosystem reveals its full, strange complexity. Because Meganeura was not the only large flying insect in that sky. It shared the air with Meganeuropsis permiana, a close relative found in Permian deposits in Kansas and Oklahoma, with a wingspan reaching 75 centimeters, making it the largest flying insect ever confirmed by fossil evidence. It shared the sky with giant mayflies, with enormous cockroaches. Yes, the Carboniferous was sometimes called the Age of Cockroaches, because cockroach relatives made up a significant portion of known insect fossils from this period. And with creatures so strange and so unlike anything alive today, that taxonomy struggles to classify them. The prey available to Meganeura included other insects, certainly, but also the juvenile forms of the giant amphibians that prowled the swamp margins. Early arachnids, some of them also scaling upward in the oxygen-rich atmosphere, potentially small early reptiles. It hunted the way modern dragonflies hunt, with staggering precision. Studies of modern dragonfly hunting behavior, published in journals including Science and Nature over the past 2 decades, have revealed that dragonflies are among the most successful predators on Earth, catching their target on roughly 95% of attempts. They do not chase prey reactively. They calculate. They predict the future position of a moving target and intercept it, adjusting their flight path mid-air with a neural processing speed that remains poorly understood even today. Scale that up to 70 centimeters of wingspan, 30 centimeters of body, and compound eyes the size of golf balls. Now put it in a forest where the trees are 40 meters tall, the air is 35% oxygen, and nothing has yet evolved that is fast enough or airborne enough to threaten it. This was not a marginal creature scraping out a living at the edge of an ecosystem. This was a keystone predator of the Carboniferous sky, a biological masterpiece assembled by 300 million years of evolutionary pressure, handed a perfect atmosphere, and turned loose on a world that had never seen anything like it. And it was already living on borrowed time. The Carboniferous did not end quietly. It ended the way most great eras end, with a catastrophe that was slow enough to be invisible while it was happening, and total enough to erase an entire world by the time it was done. Around 300 million years ago, the climate began to shift. The vast tropical forests that had been pumping oxygen into the atmosphere for tens of millions of years started to fragment. The supercontinent Pangaea was assembling itself, grinding tectonic plates together in slow motion, reshaping coastlines and mountain ranges and the circulation of ocean currents. The interior of this enormous land mass began to dry out. Rainfall patterns changed. The swampy, humid, coal-forming forests that had dominated the equatorial regions started to collapse. Paleontologists and geologists call this event the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. It happened approximately 307 million years ago, and it was not a single dramatic moment. It was a fragmentation, the continuous forest breaking apart into isolated patches, separated by drier terrain that the swamp-adapted megaflora could not cross. Like islands, each patch of surviving forest smaller than the last, each patch an isolated pocket of the old world, slowly shrinking. The ecological consequences were immediate and severe. Species that had evolved in a continuous, unbroken forest suddenly found themselves trapped in fragments. Gene flow between populations collapsed. Local extinctions cascaded. The extraordinary biodiversity of the Carboniferous coal forests, a biodiversity we are still mapping from fossil evidence, still finding new species in, began to unravel from the edges inward. And as the forests died, the oxygen production slowed. Remember that the oxygen spike of the Carboniferous was driven by one specific mechanism: trees dying without rotting, locking carbon underground instead of releasing it back into the atmosphere. But by the late Carboniferous and into the Permian period that followed, the fungi and bacteria capable of breaking down lignin had finally caught up. Decomposition was now happening. Dead trees were now rotting. Carbon was now cycling back into the atmosphere. The extraordinary accidental oxygen pump that had run for 50 million years was shutting down. Atmospheric oxygen began to fall. Over the course of millions of years, through the Permian period, which ran from 299 million to 252 million years ago, oxygen levels dropped from their Carboniferous peak of perhaps 35% back toward values closer to what we breathe today. Some models suggest oxygen fell even lower than current levels during parts of the Permian, perhaps dipping toward 15 or 16% before stabilizing. For insects built around a tracheal respiratory system, this was not an inconvenience. It was an existential ceiling descending. Think about what this meant in practical terms. An Arthropleura-sized body in an atmosphere of 15% oxygen would be facing a respiratory crisis at every moment. Those tracheal tubes, already running long to reach the center of an enormous body, would now be carrying significantly less oxygen per breath of air processed. The deepest tissues would begin to suffer. Metabolic efficiency would collapse. An individual that size would be fighting its own biology just to stay alive, let alone feed and reproduce. Evolution responds to this kind of pressure with brutal efficiency. Individuals that are smaller require less oxygen delivery to their core tissues. Smaller individuals survive. Larger individuals die before reproducing. Generation by generation, the average size of a population shrinks. Not because anything is hunting the giants, not because the food supply has changed, simply because the atmosphere itself has become incompatible with a large body built on the tracheal plan. This is one of the most powerful demonstrations of a principle that paleontology has confirmed again and again across hundreds of millions of years. Body size in animals is not just a product of evolution and ecology. It is a product of atmosphere. The gas mixture surrounding a creature at any given moment in geological history is one of the most powerful constraints on what that creature can become. And the atmosphere of Earth has never stayed still. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, because oxygen decline alone may not be the complete explanation for why giant insects disappeared. The scientific literature on this question is genuinely contested, and any honest account of the evidence has to acknowledge that. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012 examined the relationship between insect body size and atmospheric oxygen across a large data set of fossil insects spanning multiple geological periods. The results confirmed a general correlation: larger insects during high oxygen intervals, smaller insects during low oxygen intervals. But the correlation was not perfect. There were periods of relatively high oxygen that did not produce giant insects. There were insect lineages that shrank faster than the oxygen decline would predict. Something else was happening. Something that arrived during the Permian and accelerated into the Triassic period that followed. The reptiles were getting better. This sounds almost dismissive, but the evolutionary trajectory of early reptiles through the Permian is one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of vertebrate life. The first reptiles of the Carboniferous were small, lizard-like creatures. Interesting, certainly, but not the dominant predators of their ecosystems. Over the course of the Permian, however, reptile lineages began to diversify at an extraordinary rate. Bodies grew, metabolisms became more efficient, hunting strategies became more sophisticated. By the mid-Permian, the synapsids, the lineage that would eventually produce mammals, including you, had produced animals like Dimetrodon. Not a dinosaur, despite what pop culture suggests. A synapsid, a creature with a massive sail on its back, possibly used for thermoregulation, and a skull full of differentiated teeth, canines, incisors, molars, that represented a leap forward in predatory complexity. Dimetrodon was hunting in a world that still contained giant insects, and it was very, very good at its job. More critically, the diapsid reptiles, the lineage that would eventually produce dinosaurs, crocodilians, and birds, were also diversifying. And some of them were developing something that would change the rules of the sky forever: the ability to pursue fast-moving aerial prey. Early archosaurs, the ancestors of the dinosaurs, began experimenting with longer limbs, faster reflexes, and hunting behaviors that put them in competition with giant flying insects for the first time. For hundreds of millions of years, the sky had been the exclusive domain of insects. No vertebrate had challenged them. But as reptiles grew more agile, as their sensory systems became more sophisticated, the giant flying insects of the late Paleozoic began to face something they had never encountered before: a predator capable of catching them. This is a hypothesis, not a confirmed mechanism. The fossil record does not preserve the moment a proto-archosaur caught and ate a Meganeura, but the timing is striking. The decline of giant flying insects correlates not just with falling oxygen levels, but with the diversification of the first genuinely agile terrestrial and semi-arboreal reptiles. Two pressures arriving simultaneously: the atmosphere tightening the ceiling on body size from above. New predators eliminating the largest individuals with ruthless consistency from below. Caught between physics and biology, the age of the giant insect was ending. And then came the event that ended everything else too. 252 million years ago, something happened to this planet that makes every other catastrophe in the history of life look modest by comparison. Not the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, not the ice ages that sculpted the continents into their current shapes, not any single volcanic eruption, any tsunami, any drought. What happened at the end of the Permian period was a killing event so total, so prolonged, and so devastating that paleontologists who spend their careers studying it still reach for the same word when they try to describe its scale: the Great Dying. Roughly 96% of all marine species vanished. 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species disappeared. Entire taxonomic families, groups of related creatures that had existed for hundreds of millions of years, were simply deleted from the living world. The oceans very nearly died completely. Reefs that had been building for hundreds of millions of years dissolved as the water turned acidic. The recovery took 10 million years. Some ecosystems took 20 million years to rebuild anything approaching their former complexity. The cause was the Siberian traps. A volcanic province in what is now northern Russia began erupting approximately 252 million years ago. Not in the way volcanoes typically erupt, not as a single dramatic explosion, not as a localized event.
The Siberian traps were a flood basalt event. Enormous fissures in the crust, splitting open across an area roughly the size of Western Europe, pouring lava onto the surface continuously for somewhere between 1 and 2 million years. The total volume of material erupted has been estimated at around 3 million cubic kilometers. The lava flows themselves would have been catastrophic enough, but the real killer was what came out of the magma along with the rock. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, released as the lava burned through thick deposits of coal and organic sediment on its way to the surface. Vast quantities of volcanic gases injecting directly into an atmosphere that was already under stress from millions of years of climate shift. The carbon dioxide alone drove a global temperature increase estimated at between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius over the course of tens of thousands of years. That sounds gradual. In human terms, it was. In terms of the pace at which ecosystems can adapt, it was instantaneous. Species that had spent millions of years evolving in stable temperature bands suddenly found their entire range shifting faster than they could follow. The sulfur dioxide created acid rain on a global scale. The methane created feedback loops that accelerated warming beyond what the volcanism alone would have produced. The oceans absorbed carbon dioxide and became acidic. Creatures with calcium carbonate shells, which is to say, most marine invertebrates, found their shells dissolving. The marine food web collapsed from the bottom up.
Coral reefs, which had existed in various forms since the Cambrian period, were almost entirely destroyed. It would take roughly 10 million years before reefs of comparable complexity appeared again. On land, the forests died. The animals that depended on the forests died. The animals that depended on those animals died. In the fossil record, this event appears as a sharp line, literally a visible boundary in rock strata around the world, a layer where the fossils of hundreds of species simply stop. Above that line, the world is almost silent. Below it, the full complexity of the late Permian. Above it, almost nothing. For the giant insects, the Great Dying was the final blow. But it is important to understand that by the time the Permian extinction arrived, the age of truly giant insects was already essentially over. Arthropleura had disappeared from the fossil record by the mid-Permian, roughly 270 million years ago, 30 million years before the Great Dying. Meganeura and its relatives had already declined dramatically. The conditions that had produced them, the extraordinary oxygen atmosphere, the continuous cold forests, the absence of agile vertebrate competition, had been eroding for tens of millions of years. What the Great Dying did was close the door, permanently. When life rebuilt itself after the Permian extinction, it rebuilt in a different atmosphere. It rebuilt under different selective pressures. It rebuilt in a world where vertebrates, the survivors of the catastrophe, now diversifying rapidly into the ecological vacuums left by the dead, were everywhere. The early Triassic world was a world where the archosaurs were accelerating toward their eventual dominance, where the ancestors of the dinosaurs were growing larger and faster and more efficient, where the sky, which had once been the unchallenged domain of giant insects, was about to become contested territory in ways that would have been unimaginable in the Carboniferous. The insects that survived the Great Dying were small. They survived partly because small bodies need less oxygen, partly because small bodies can find shelter in microhabitats, cracks in rock, gaps in soil, the spaces beneath bark, that larger creatures cannot access. partly because short generation times allow rapid evolutionary response to changing conditions. An insect that breeds in weeks can adapt in centuries. A large, slow-reproducing giant adapts in millions of years. In a world changing as fast as the end Permian world was changing, rapid adaptation was the only currency that mattered. And so the survivors were small, and their descendants were small, and the descendants of their descendants were small. But here is the question that the fossil record forces us to ask. Here is the detail that does not quite fit the neat narrative of oxygen decline and predator pressure and mass extinction. The oxygen levels recovered. After the Permian minimum, atmospheric oxygen did not stay low. Through the Triassic and into the Jurassic period, oxygen levels rose again. By the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, the age of the great dinosaurs, 150 million to 100 million years ago, some atmospheric models suggest oxygen had climbed back toward 25 or even 26%. Not quite the Carboniferous peak, but significantly higher than today, higher than the values during which giant insects had previously evolved. And yet, the giant insects did not come back. Triassic insects were small. Jurassic insects were small. Cretaceous insects were small. In fact, the Cretaceous produced the most diverse insect fauna in the history of the planet, preserved in extraordinary detail in amber deposits from Burma, Lebanon, France, and New Jersey. But none of these creatures came anywhere near the body sizes of the Carboniferous giants. The largest flying insects of the Cretaceous were impressive by modern standards. By Carboniferous standards, they were nothing. Why? This is the question that keeps entomologists and paleontologists returning to the data. Because the simple answer, oxygen went down, insects got smaller, does not fully explain why oxygen going back up did not produce giants again. The answer, most researchers now believe, involves something that appeared in the Cretaceous and changed the rules of the sky more fundamentally than any shift in atmospheric chemistry. Birds. Birds did not appear suddenly. They did not arrive fully formed from nowhere. They were dinosaurs, specifically feathered theropod dinosaurs that had been experimenting with flight-related adaptations since at least the late Jurassic period, 160 million years ago. Archaeopteryx, the famous transitional fossil found in the Solnhofen limestone deposits of Bavaria and first described in 1861, showed the world what the earliest birds looked like: toothed, clawed, feathered, somewhere between a small predatory dinosaur and the birds you see outside your window today. But Archaeopteryx was not a particularly efficient flyer. It was a beginning, an experiment, a rough draft. Over the course of the Cretaceous period, birds diversified and refined. Their skeletons became lighter. Their flight muscles became more powerful relative to body mass. Their brains, particularly the regions associated with visual processing and motor control, expanded significantly. Their eyes became extraordinary, capable of detecting motion at speeds and distances that no insect could match, capable of processing visual information fast enough to track a moving target through complex three-dimensional space, capable of seeing into the ultraviolet spectrum in ways that gave them information about the world invisible to most other predators. They became, in short, the most sophisticated aerial predators the planet had ever produced. And they ate insects. This sounds obvious. Of course birds eat insects. Every child knows that birds eat insects. But the evolutionary implications of this fact, playing out over 150 million years, are more profound than they first appear. Because when birds entered the sky in significant numbers, they did not simply add another predator to an existing system. They fundamentally changed the selective pressure on every flying insect on the planet. Consider what it means to be a large flying insect in a world with birds. A large body is visible. A large body is slow relative to its size. The physics of flight scale poorly, and a larger insect requires proportionally more energy to stay airborne and maneuver quickly. A large body represents a significant caloric reward for any predator that can catch it. And birds, with their extraordinary visual acuity and flight agility, could catch large flying insects with a consistency that no previous predator had ever achieved. In the Carboniferous, Meganeura flew through skies where nothing could threaten it. There were no birds. There were no bats. Bats would not evolve until around 52 million years ago, deep in the Eocene epoch. There were no fast-moving arboreal reptiles with the sensory equipment to track a 70-centimeter dragonfly through a forest canopy. The sky was safe. Large body size in the sky carried no survival penalty beyond the physiological costs of building and maintaining that body. The moment birds appeared, that calculation inverted. Large body size in a flying insect now meant visibility. It meant slower acceleration relative to a pursuing bird. It meant a higher caloric value that made the pursuit worthwhile for the predator. Every generation, in every population of flying insects, the largest individuals were disproportionately targeted, disproportionately eaten, disproportionately prevented from passing their genes to the next generation. This is directional selection operating with ruthless consistency across millions of years. You do not need a sudden catastrophe to eliminate giant flying insects when you have a highly efficient predator systematically removing the largest individuals from every population, every generation, for 150 million years. The math does not require drama. It just requires time. And geological time provides time in quantities that make human comprehension stagger. A research paper published in the journal PLOS1 in 2012 examined insect body size across geological time in relation to both atmospheric oxygen levels and the appearance of birds and bats. The results were striking. The correlation between oxygen and insect size held reasonably well for the pre-bird era. But after the appearance of birds in the Cretaceous and then bats in the Eocene, insect body sizes dropped in ways that exceeded what oxygen levels alone predicted. The researchers concluded that predation pressure from birds and bats was a significant independent driver of insect miniaturization, operating on top of, and in some periods more powerfully than, the atmospheric constraint. Two forces working in the same direction over vast stretches of time. The atmosphere set a ceiling. The birds pushed the floor up from below. The space in which a giant flying insect could exist simply closed. But birds were not the only new pressure on the insect world during the Cretaceous. Something else was happening simultaneously that would transform the relationship between insects and the living world more profoundly than any predator ever could. The flowering plants were evolving. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, first appeared in the fossil record approximately 130 million years ago, in the early Cretaceous. Before their arrival, the dominant vegetation of the Mesozoic world was gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, ferns, plants that reproduced without flowers, without fruit, without the elaborate chemical and structural innovations that define the flowering plants we know today. The appearance and rapid diversification of flowering plants during the Cretaceous is one of the most dramatic events in the history of plant evolution. Charles Darwin himself called it an abominable mystery. The speed with which angiosperms diversified and came to dominate terrestrial ecosystems seemed to violate his gradualistic view of evolutionary change. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowering plants had colonized virtually every terrestrial habitat on Earth and were well on their way to becoming the dominant form of plant life on the planet, and they brought insects with them. The relationship between flowering plants and insects is one of the deepest and most consequential coevolutionary partnerships in the history of life. Flowers needed pollinators. Insects needed nectar and pollen. Each drove the evolution of the other in an escalating spiral of mutual adaptation that produced, over tens of millions of years, the extraordinary diversity of both flowering plants and insects that defines the modern world. But here is the critical detail for our story. Pollination is a task that favors small insects. A bee the size of your thumbnail can enter a flower, access nectar, pick up pollen grains on its body, and carry them to another flower with a precision and efficiency that a larger insect cannot match. The architecture of flowers, the shape, depth, and access geometry of the structures within them evolved in dialogue with the body sizes of the insects visiting them. Small insects and small flowers co-evolved together, each shaping the other over millions of years. A giant insect is poorly equipped for this world. A creature with a 70-centimeter wingspan cannot navigate between flowers. A millipede 2 meters long has no meaningful relationship with angiosperm pollination. The ecological roles that drove insect diversification through the Cretaceous and into the Cenozoic were roles that rewarded smallness, precision, and specialization. Not size, not brute scale, not the kind of biological ambition that had produced Meganeura. The world had changed its priorities, and insects, with their extraordinary evolutionary flexibility, their short generation times, their astronomical reproductive rates, responded to those new priorities with breathtaking speed. They miniaturized. They specialized. They diversified into ecological niches of almost incomprehensible variety. Niches defined by specific flowers, specific plant tissues, specific microhabitats, specific host organisms. The beetle alone, as the famous biologist J.B.S. Haldane may or may not have actually said, suggests that God has an inordinate fondness for them. There are more described species of beetle than of any other animal group on Earth. Around 400,000 known species. Estimates of undescribed species run into the millions. None of them are the size of a dog. None of them need to be. The world they inhabit does not reward that. The atmosphere does not permit it. The birds would find them too quickly. The flowers would not accommodate them. The ecological logic that produced Arthropleura and Meganeura has been dismantled piece by piece over 250 million years and replaced with a completely different set of rules. Rules that insects have mastered more completely than any other group of animals on Earth. But there is one more layer to this story. One more piece of evidence that the scientific community has been assembling over the past 2 decades, using tools that Charles Brongniart, finding his giant dragonfly fossils in a French coal mine in 1885, could not have imagined. The evidence from the insects themselves, from inside their bodies, from the geometry of their respiratory systems, preserved in amber and in exquisitely detailed compression fossils, examined under synchrotron radiation and CT scanning technology, revealing secrets that no amount of surface observation could ever have disclosed. What that evidence shows has forced researchers to significantly revise their understanding of why giant insects disappeared and why they can never come back. When you look at a modern dragonfly under a powerful microscope, you see something that looks, at first glance, like a miracle of engineering. The tracheal system threading through its body is not a simple network of tubes running randomly through the tissues. It is an organized, hierarchical architecture. Large trunks branching into smaller tubes, those branching into smaller still, the finest branches, called tracheoles, reaching diameters of less than 1 micrometer, thinner than a human hair, reaching into spaces between individual cells. It is extraordinary, and it is, as we have established, fundamentally limited by scale. But until relatively recently, paleontologists working on giant insect fossils could not see inside their subjects. They could measure wingspans, they could examine mouthparts and leg structures, they could make inferences about behavior and ecology from surface morphology and trackway evidence. But the internal architecture of a carboniferous insect, the actual geometry of its respiratory system, was invisible, hidden inside rock, inaccessible. Then synchrotron imaging arrived. A synchrotron is a particle accelerator that produces X-rays of extraordinary intensity and precision, beams that can penetrate dense rock and reveal internal structures at resolutions that conventional CT scanning cannot approach. In the past 2 decades, synchrotron facilities in France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Germany have been used to examine insect fossils in ways that were previously impossible. Not just compression fossils in rock, also insects preserved in amber, frozen in tree resin millions of years ago, their external structures preserved in extraordinary detail. Their internal tissues sometimes present as ghostly chemical traces that synchrotron imaging can map. What researchers found inside fossil insects confirmed the oxygen hypothesis in ways that went beyond correlation. Beyond the statistical relationship between atmospheric oxygen levels and body size in the fossil record, they found direct physical evidence inside the insects themselves. A study conducted by researchers at the University of California, Irvine, and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences examined the tracheal systems of modern insects across a range of body sizes and compared the geometry, specifically the proportion of body volume occupied by tracheal tubes, to what the same measurement would imply for a Meganeura-sized body. The results were unambiguous. In small modern insects, tracheal tubes occupy a relatively modest proportion of total body volume. Efficient, compact, doing their job without dominating the internal architecture. But as insect body size increases, the proportion of body volume that must be dedicated to tracheal tubes to maintain adequate oxygen delivery increases disproportionately. It does not scale linearly. It scales faster than linearly. The larger the body, the greater the fraction of that body that must be given over to the respiratory infrastructure. At Meganeura's body size, in today's atmosphere, the tracheal system required to oxygenate the deepest tissues would occupy such a large proportion of the body's internal volume that there would be almost no room left for anything else. Muscles, digestive organs, reproductive structures, the infrastructure of life itself. All of it would be crowded out by the sheer mechanical requirement of moving enough oxygen from the surface to the center. In a 21% oxygen atmosphere, a Meganeura-sized insect is not just difficult, it is geometrically impossible. The numbers do not work. The body cannot be built. In a 35% oxygen atmosphere, the same calculation produces a different result. The higher concentration of oxygen in each volume of air means the tracheal tubes can be shorter and narrower for the same oxygen delivery. The proportion of body volume dedicated to respiratory infrastructure drops dramatically. Suddenly, the geometry works. Suddenly, there is room for muscles, for organs, for all the biological machinery that makes a living creature functional. The atmosphere was not just a background condition for Carboniferous giant insects, it was a structural component of their bodies. Remove the atmosphere, and the body plan collapses. Not metaphorically, mathematically. This finding was reinforced by CT scanning studies of fossil insects from the Cretaceous, smaller than their Carboniferous predecessors, but still preserving internal structures in enough detail to trace the tracheal architecture. Researchers at the American Museum of Natural History, working with specimens from Cretaceous amber deposits in Burma, were able to map tracheal geometry in three-dimensional detail for the first time. What they found showed insects already operating close to the mechanical limits of the tracheal system for their body sizes, not with room to spare, but at or near the ceiling of what the system could deliver. The Cretaceous insects were not small because evolution had become less ambitious. They were small because the atmosphere had made anything larger mechanically inviable, and because birds had made anything approaching that ceiling immediately lethal. They were pressed against a wall from two directions at once. And they adapted, because insects always adapt. But there is one more element of this story that almost never gets discussed outside specialist literature. One more factor that operated quietly over vast stretches of time, reshaping the insect body plan in ways that went beyond simple size reduction. The evolution of insect flight efficiency. Modern insects, despite being small, are aerodynamically more sophisticated than their Carboniferous predecessors in ways that the fossil record is only beginning to reveal. The wing venation patterns of modern dragonflies, the network of veins that give the wing its structural rigidity and aerodynamic properties, are more complex, more refined, and in computational fluid dynamics modeling, demonstrably more efficient than the wing venation of Meganeura. A study published in the Journal of Experimental Biology used high-speed cameras and computational modeling to analyze the flight mechanics of modern dragonflies at the scale of Meganeura. The conclusion was that a Meganeura-sized insect with modern dragonfly wing geometry would fly significantly better than a Meganeura-sized insect with Carboniferous wing geometry. Evolution, in other words, has continued to refine the insect flight apparatus for 300 million years, but it has been doing so in a direction that optimizes small body performance, not large body performance. The refinements that made modern dragonflies extraordinary flyers are refinements that work best, and in some cases only work, at small scales. The body plan itself has been rewritten, not just shrunk, rewritten. This is the deepest reason why giant insects are gone and will not return. It is not just that the atmosphere is wrong, though it is. It is not just that birds and bats would eliminate giant flying insects before any population could establish itself, though they would. It is that the insect body plan, after 300 million years of evolution in a world of small-scale, high-efficiency, specialization-driven ecology, has moved away from the architectural space in which giants are possible. The blueprint has changed. To rebuild Meganeura, you would not just need to change the atmosphere. You would need to rewind 300 million years of evolutionary refinement. You would need to reconstruct a body plan that no longer exists anywhere in the living world, that has no surviving lineage preserving its essential features, that left no descendants carrying the specific combination of anatomical traits that made it functional. You would need, essentially, to rebuild a vanished world from scratch. The atmosphere, the forests, the absence of birds, the absence of bats, the absence of flowering plants and the ecological logic they imposed, the specific tracheal geometry of a Carboniferous insect, the wing venation of a creature that has been extinct for 300 million years. Change any one of those factors, and the calculation fails. Change all of them simultaneously, and you have not just rebuilt Meganeura. You have rebuilt the entire Carboniferous. You have reconstructed a planet. That planet is gone. It will not come back. The geological processes that produced it, the accidental coincidence of lignin evolution without lignin decomposition, the specific configuration of Pangea, the oxygen spike, the forest collapse, were not inevitable. They were not part of some repeating cycle. They were a singular event, a specific alignment of circumstances that occurred once in 4.5 billion years of planetary history and produced briefly, magnificently, terrifyingly, a world where insects could grow to the size of dogs. That window opened. Life rushed through it, and then it closed. So what remains? Not the giants themselves, not their direct descendants, not even a lineage carrying some faint echo of the Carboniferous body plan in its genes, waiting for the right conditions to express itself again. The giant insects are gone in a way that very few extinct creatures are truly gone. Not just dead, but architecturally erased. The biological blueprint that produced them dissolved into geological time and was replaced by something fundamentally different. But the world those giants built is still here, under your feet. Every piece of coal ever burned in the history of human civilization came from the Carboniferous forests that fed the oxygen spike that made the giant insects possible. The Industrial Revolution, the event that more than any other shaped the modern world, that produced the cities and the technologies and the global economy that defines human existence today, ran on the compressed bodies of the trees that Arthropleura walked through. The carbon that those trees locked underground for 300 million years came back into the atmosphere as smoke from factory chimneys and steam engines and power plants. We burned the Carboniferous. We are still burning it. The carbon that giant millipedes walked over is now in the air above your head. There is something almost dizzying about that chain of causation. A biological accident 300 million years ago, trees evolving lignin before fungi evolved the tools to break it down, created a geological deposit that powered human modernity. The world you live in is downstream of the world Meganeura flew through. The fossils remain too. Not many, not in the condition we would wish, but enough. The Commentry coal basin in central France, where Charles Brongniart found his Meganeura specimens in 1885, has yielded dozens of giant insect fossils over the decades since. The collections of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris contain specimens that still shock visitors who encounter them without preparation. Wingspans pressed into dark rock, the venation patterns of 2-foot dragonfly wings preserved in detail fine enough to trace individual veins with a fingertip. The Maison Creek fossil beds of Illinois, dating to approximately 309 million years ago, are among the richest Carboniferous fossil deposits in the world. Preserved in ironstone nodules, rounded concretions that split apart to reveal their contents with the drama of a gift being unwrapped, the Maison Creek beds have produced insects, arachnids, plants, and soft-bodied organisms of extraordinary variety and preservation quality. Specimens from Maison Creek sit in collections at the Field Museum in Chicago, at the Smithsonian Institution, at universities across the United States, representing a snapshot of Carboniferous life so detailed that researchers are still extracting new information from existing collections decades after the specimens were found. The Arthropleura trackways continue to appear. In 2023, a set of trackways found in sandstone at Howick Bay on the Northumberland coast of England made international news. The trackways, dating to approximately 326 million years ago, showed an individual Arthropleura nearly 2 meters long, not the largest known, but the oldest. The preservation was exceptional. Individual leg impressions were clear enough to count. The creature had been moving across a sand surface near the edge of an ancient equatorial forest, leaving evidence of its passage in sediment that would spend the next 326 million years turning slowly to stone before a geologist noticed it eroding out of a coastal cliff. 326 million years. That number deserves a moment of genuine contemplation. When that Arthropleura walked across that sand, the Atlantic Ocean did not exist. North America and Europe were joined in a single landmass. The Himalayas had not begun to form. The Andes did not exist. The Alps did not exist. Every mountain range you can name that defines the geography of the modern world had yet to be built by the tectonic collisions that were, at that point, still millions of years in the future. The sun was slightly dimmer. The moon was slightly closer. The day was slightly shorter. Earth rotated faster then, each day lasting perhaps 22 hours rather than 24. And across a sandbar at the edge of a coal forest that would one day power Victorian England, something enormous walked on hundreds of legs and left footprints that a human being would find in 2023 and immediately photograph with a smartphone. The continuity of that image is almost too much to process. Modern insects, for their part, have not given up on scale entirely. They have simply pursued it differently. The titan beetle of the Amazon rainforest, Titanus giganteus, reaches body lengths of 17 centimeters. The Goliath beetle of Central Africa can weigh 100 grams, heavier than some small birds, heavier than a computer mouse, heavier than a deck of playing cards. The Atlas moth of Southeast Asia has a wingspan of up to 25 centimeters. The giant weta of New Zealand, a cricket relative, can weigh 70 grams and is heavy enough that individuals have been observed eating carrots held between their forelegs while sitting on a human hand. These are impressive creatures. They push the modern limits of what the tracheal system can support in a 21% oxygen atmosphere, in a world full of birds and bats, in an ecology built around flowering plants and the logic of specialization. They are, in their own way, experiments in the same direction that Meganeura represented. Evolution probing the upper boundary of what is physically possible in the current atmosphere. But they are not Meganeura. They are not Arthropleura. They are not the creatures that ruled the Carboniferous sky and forest floor with a dominance that nothing has matched before or since. They are small echoes of a vanished ambition, pale reflections of a biological possibility that existed once and will not exist again. The scientific questions that remain open are genuine and unresolved, and any honest account of this story has to end with them rather than pretend they have been answered. We do not know the precise upper limit of atmospheric oxygen during the Carboniferous. The models range from 30 to 35%, with significant uncertainty at both ends. The calibration of these models depends on isotopic measurements and organic carbon burial rates that carry their own error margins. The exact oxygen concentration matters for understanding exactly how big an insect could theoretically get, and whether the largest known specimens were approaching the physical ceiling or still had room to grow. We do not fully understand why the Carboniferous rainforest collapse happened when it did, at the pace it did, with the geographic pattern it showed. The climate models are improving, but the specific trigger, whether it was primarily tectonic, primarily astronomical, primarily driven by the evolution of lignin decomposition, or some combination of all three, remains a subject of active research. We do not have complete body fossils of Arthropleura. We have fragmentary material, sections of the exoskeleton, isolated segments, the trackways. The reconstruction of its full body plan, its head structure, its mouth parts in detail, is based on inference from related taxa and from the trackway evidence. Every new body fossil fragment that appears modifies the picture slightly. The picture is not complete. We do not fully understand the sensory world of Meganeura. Its compound eyes are preserved in fossils well enough to study their structure, but the neural processing behind those eyes, the speed of its visual system, its ability to track moving targets, the degree to which its hunting behavior resembled that of modern dragonflies, can only be inferred from comparative anatomy and evolutionary reasoning. We are reconstructing a mind from stone. And perhaps most fundamentally, we do not know with certainty what the ceiling was. We know giant insects existed. We know the conditions that made them possible. We know those conditions are gone. But we do not know, with the precision that science demands, exactly where the upper limit of insect body size sits in a high-oxygen world, because we have never been able to test it. We cannot reconstruct a carboniferous atmosphere in a laboratory large enough to raise insects through multiple generations and watch what happens. We have the fossils, we have the models, we have the physics, but we do not have the experiment. That uncertainty is not a failure of science. It is the honest condition of a discipline that works with fragments, with the broken, compressed, chemically altered remnants of living creatures that walked and flew and crawled through a world that existed hundreds of millions of years before the first human being thought to wonder about it. Paleontology is an act of reconstruction performed under impossible constraints, with incomplete evidence, using tools that keep improving, but never quite reach the resolution we need. Every answer it produces comes wrapped in caveats and confidence intervals, and the humble acknowledgement that the next fossil, the next analytical technique, the next data set might change everything. That is not a weakness. That is what makes it extraordinary. Because despite all of that, despite the fragmentary evidence, the imperfect models, the unresolvable uncertainties, we know that Meganeura was real. We know that Arthropleura was real. We know that for tens of millions of years, this planet hosted flying insects with wingspans wider than your outstretched arms, walking invertebrates heavier than your dog, an atmospheric chemistry so different from today's that a modern human transported to the Carboniferous would feel the difference in every breath. A richness, an oiliness, a slight dizziness from oxygen concentrations a third higher than anything your lungs have ever processed. We know that world existed. We know it was erased. We know why in broad outline, and we are filling in the details one fossil, one synchrotron scan, one isotopic measurement at a time. And we know that nothing like it is coming back. The window that opened 359 million years ago, that extraordinary, accidental, temporary coincidence of unrotting trees and rising oxygen and empty skies and absent birds, closed 252 million years ago and locked itself permanently behind a mass extinction that reset the biological world and handed it to the reptiles, and then to the mammals, and eventually to a primate species clever enough to dig up the coal those ancient forests left behind and burn it to power machines capable of asking questions like this one. The giants are gone. The world that made them is gone. What remains are their shadows in stone, their chemistry in coal seams, their evolutionary legacy in the small, extraordinary, impossibly diverse insects that inherited the planet they once dominated. Look at a dragonfly the next time you see one. A real one, hovering over a pond, its wings catching the light. It is a diminished thing measured against Meganeura. 16 centimeters of wingspan against 70. A fraction of the mass, a shadow of the scale. But those compound eyes are still tracking movement with 95% accuracy. Those wings are still performing aerodynamic calculations that our best engineering has not fully replicated. That creature is still the product of 350 million years of continuous refinement, carrying in its genome the deep history of a lineage that survived the Great Dying, survived the rise of birds, survived the flowering plant revolution, survived every atmospheric shift and mass extinction and ecological upheaval that the planet has managed to produce. It is small. It is ancient. It is, in its own quiet way, indestructible. The age of giants ended. The age of insects never did. There is a thought experiment that paleontologists occasionally use when they want to communicate the true scale of what was lost at the end of the Paleozoic era. It goes like this. Take everything alive on Earth today. Every species of insect, every bird, every mammal, every reptile, every fish, every plant. All of it. The full inventory of modern biological diversity, which itself represents only a fraction of the species that have ever lived, but which is still almost incomprehensibly vast. Somewhere between 8 and 10 million species by current estimates, of which we have formally described and named perhaps 2 million. Now imagine losing 96% of it. Not gradually, not over millions of years of slow decline, but effectively, instantaneously, on a geological timescale, within tens of thousands of years. Gone. That is what the Great Dying did to the world that produced giant insects. That is the magnitude of the reset button that was pressed 252 million years ago. And the world that rebuilt itself afterward was not a restored version of what came before. It was something genuinely new. Something built from the survivors of a catastrophe so total that it had essentially cleared the board and forced life to start the game over with whatever pieces remained. The pieces that remained were small. They were generalists. They were survivors not because they were the strongest or the largest or the most ecologically dominant, but because they were the most resilient, the most capable of enduring conditions that killed almost everything else. Small insects hiding in soil, early synapsids sheltering in burrows, marine organisms in the deepest, coldest, most chemically stable parts of the ocean, where the worst effects of the volcanic gases and the acidification were temporarily buffered. From those survivors, the modern world was built. Every creature alive today is descended from something that survived the Great Dying. Every insect you have ever seen, every bird, every mammal, including yourself. You are the descendant of a survivor of the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life on this planet. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is a clarifying one. It clarifies, for instance, why the giant insects never came back even when the oxygen recovered. Because the survivors that built the post-Permian world were not carrying the Carboniferous blueprint. They were carrying the survivor blueprint. Small, flexible, fast reproducing, capable of finding a living in the margins of a devastated world. The evolutionary lineages that had scaled up to giant size in the Carboniferous had been erased. What remained were the lineages that had stayed small, and those lineages diversified into the post-Permian world and became the ancestors of everything alive today. Evolution does not restore what has been lost. It does not circle back. It does not rebuild the Carboniferous giant insect body plan from first principles simply because the atmospheric conditions for doing so have temporarily returned. It works forward, always forward, with whatever materials are currently available, responding to the pressures of the current moment rather than reconstructing the solutions of the past. This is a point worth dwelling on, because there is a temptation, natural, understandable, almost inevitable, to think of evolutionary history as a progression towards something, a trajectory with a direction, a story with a destination. We are, all of us, shaped by narratives, and narratives have arcs, and arcs lead somewhere. But evolution has no arc. It has no destination. It does not know that the Carboniferous giant insects were a magnificent experiment that ended prematurely. It does not know that Meganeura was extraordinary. It does not know that anything was lost. It simply responds to the chemistry of the atmosphere and the pressure of predators and the availability of food and the accidents of mutation and the randomness of which individuals happen to survive and reproduce on any given day, in any given place. The giant insects were not a goal that evolution was working toward. They were a local solution to a temporary set of conditions. When the conditions changed, the solution became untenable. Evolution found other solutions. It always does. What this means for us, for the humans asking these questions, digging up these fossils, running these models, building these synchrotrons, is both humbling and, in a strange way, liberating. The world we live in is not the inevitable outcome of 3.5 billion years of biological progress. It is the specific, contingent, accident-shaped result of a particular sequence of events that could have gone differently at almost any point and produced an entirely different present. If the Siberian traps had not erupted when they did, or at the scale they did, the synapsids might not have diversified so rapidly in the early Triassic. The dinosaurs might not have come to dominate as they did. The mammals might have remained small and marginal for much longer, or forever. The particular sequence of events that produced, eventually, a primate capable of wondering about carboniferous dragonflies is so contingent, so dependent on specific catastrophes occurring in specific ways at specific times, that imagining it repeating is essentially meaningless. We are an accident, an extraordinary, improbable, magnificent accident. And so was Meganeura, and so was Arthropleura, and so, in its way, is every living thing that has ever existed on this planet. The Carboniferous giants exist now only in the form of knowledge, not even memory. There was no one alive to remember them. Only knowledge, assembled painstakingly from fragments, from trackways and coastal cliffs, from wing prints in coal mine rock, from the isotopic ratios frozen in ancient organic matter, from the mathematics of atmospheric chemistry and the physics of insect respiration and the logic of evolutionary biology. That knowledge is itself a kind of miracle. The fact that a species that has existed for approximately 300,000 years, a species that spent most of that time hunting and gathering, building fires, painting caves, making tools from stone, has, in the last few centuries, developed the intellectual and technological capacity to reconstruct the detailed biography of creatures that lived 350 million years before the first human being drew breath. The fact that we can hold in our minds, simultaneously, the image of Meganeura hunting through a carboniferous forest and the chemical explanation for why it can never exist again, That capacity is not separate from the story of life on Earth. It is part of it. The most recent chapter of the most improbable story the universe has so far produced. A story that includes giant dragonflies and armored millipedes, and a sky full of oxygen, and a world that burned itself away and rose from the ashes and built birds and flowers, and a primate who found a fossil in a coal mine in France and sat down and asked, "What was this? What was it like? What happened to it?" Those questions are not small. They are not trivial. They are among the most important questions a species can ask about itself and the world it inhabits. Questions about where things come from, how they work, why they change, what is lost, and what persists. The answers paleontology provides are always incomplete, always provisional, always subject to revision by the next discovery, the next technique, the next moment when someone notices something eroding out of a coastal cliff or splits open a nodule from a coal bed and finds something inside that changes everything. That incompleteness is not a reason to distrust the answers. It is a reason to keep asking the questions. There is a Meganeura fossil sitting in a museum in Paris right now, 2.5 feet of wingspan pressed into dark Carboniferous rock, the venation of its wings preserved in detail that would have seemed impossible before the creature died and the sediment covered it, and the millions of years passed, and the coal formed around it, and the miners dug it up, and the scientist recognized what it was. It will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and long after every human being alive today has followed Meganeura into the fossil record. The stone remembers everything. We just have to learn how to read it. The giant insects are gone. The world that made them is gone. But the questions they leave behind about size and atmosphere and extinction and the improbable contingency of every living thing are very much alive, and they are asking to be answered. Let us go back, one final time, all the way back, 315 million years ago, the Carboniferous Period, middle stage. A point in time so remote that the continents beneath your feet were arranged in a configuration you would not recognize from any map you have ever seen. What will become North America sits straddled across the equator. What will become Europe is welded to its eastern edge. The Atlantic Ocean does not exist. The Pacific is wider than it will ever be again. The Tethys Sea, a vast, warm, shallow ocean that will one day close completely, its floor crumpling upward into the Himalayas and the Alps, stretches across the equatorial region of Pangaea in its early stages of assembly. The sun rises, not over a horizon you would recognize, over a forest that has no analog anywhere on Earth today. The trees nearest the waterline are lycopsids, lepidodendron, their bark patterned in diamond shapes like the skin of something alive, their crowns feathering out 30-40 meters above the waterline into fronds that filter light the color of old honey. Sigillaria stands beside them, its trunk smooth and segmented, rising straight as a column before branching near the top. Between them, giant horsetails, calamites, crowd the marshy margins, their jointed stems 3 meters tall, their whorled leaves creating a canopy at ankle height for the lycopsids above. The air is different. You would feel it immediately. Not just the heat, equatorial, humid, pressing against your skin like warm, wet cloth, but the air itself, richer, denser with oxygen. Every breath delivers more than you are accustomed to. Your blood oxygenates faster. Your thoughts clarify. There is a slight euphoria that you cannot explain, The same effect that mountaineers feel descending from altitude. The same sensation of a world suddenly becoming more vivid and more present. This is what 35% oxygen feels like. The forest floor is not silent. It is never silent. A continuous sound. Not the bird song you might expect because there are no birds. Not for another 150 million years. But something stranger and older. The percussion of enormous bodies moving through undergrowth, the rustle of leaves disturbed by creatures passing beneath them. Sounds that have no modern equivalent because the creatures making them have no modern equivalent. Something moves at the edge of the tree line. It emerges slowly, unhurried. The front end of Arthropleura appears first. Not a recognizable head in any sense you would intuitively understand, but the leading segments of an armored body, the foremost legs testing the ground ahead with a methodical patience, each footfall precise and deliberate. Then more of it comes, and more, and more. The full length of the animal resolves out of the shadow of the lycopsids and crosses the open ground near the waterline. And the thing about it, the thing that no description quite prepares you for, is not the size alone. It is the movement. It does not scuttle. It does not scramble. It flows. 2.5 meters of articulated armor moving with a fluid, wave-like motion, each segment passing the motion to the next in a mechanical sequence that looks almost peaceful, almost meditative, like watching a river move, like watching something that has no reason to hurry and has never had a reason to hurry, and carries in the calm of its movement the absolute certainty of a creature that nothing on this planet would consider eating. It crosses the open ground and disappears into the ferns on the other side. The forest absorbs it. The sounds continue. Above, and this requires you to look up, to tilt your head back and look at a sky that is slightly more saturated with oxygen than you can detect by sight, at clouds that look familiar because clouds are among the few things that have not changed. Above, something is hunting. You hear it before you see it. A sound like a large piece of fabric being snapped taut, repeated rhythmically, coming from somewhere above the upper canopy. Then it drops below the tree line, and you see it. Meganeura, 30 centimeters of body, 70 centimeters of wingspan, compound eyes that occupy most of the surface area of its head, each eye a mosaic of thousands of individual lenses, each lens feeding visual information to a neural system processing that information faster than you can consciously perceive. It is not flying aimlessly. It is hunting. You can tell by the quality of its movement, the way it holds position briefly, the rapid, small adjustments of wing angle, the slight tilt of the body as it orients on something below. Then it drops. The strike takes less than a second. A large cockroach relative, itself 15 centimeters long, which would be a monster by modern standards, disappears into the grip of Meganeura's legs before it can process the shadow overhead. The dragonfly beats upward, carrying its prey, finding a perch on the trunk of a lepidodendron 3 meters above the forest floor, and begins to feed with the unhurried efficiency of an apex predator that has just completed a routine transaction. This scene happened, not in a film, not in a novel, in a real forest on a real planet 315 million years ago. The physics that governed it, the aerodynamics of the wings, the biomechanics of the strike, the chemistry of the oxygen-rich air, were the same physics that govern the world today. The same rules, a different board. And then, slowly, imperceptibly, the board began to change. The reason we know this scene happened, the reason we can reconstruct it with any confidence at all, is that the scientific tools available to paleontology in the 21st century have reached a resolution that previous generations could not have imagined, and those tools are still improving. Every year, new analytical techniques produce new data from existing specimens. New fossils appear from places and geological formations that were not previously known to be productive. New computational methods allow researchers to model biological systems with increasing fidelity. In 2021, a research team at the University of Bristol published an analysis of Meganeura flight mechanics using computational fluid dynamics, the same mathematical modeling used in aerospace engineering. They constructed a digital model of the Meganeura wing based on the venation patterns preserved in fossil specimens and simulated its aerodynamic properties across a range of atmospheric oxygen concentrations. The results showed that Meganeura was a capable, efficient flyer in a high oxygen atmosphere, not a clumsy giant struggling against physics, but a genuinely well-adapted aerial predator whose flight mechanics were optimized for its specific atmospheric environment. In a modern atmosphere, the same wing geometry becomes significantly less efficient. The insect would struggle. In a Carboniferous atmosphere, it flew with the confidence of something perfectly suited to its world. Because it was perfectly suited to its world, every creature is. That is what evolution does. It does not build for the future. It does not hedge against atmospheric change or predator diversification or mass extinction. It builds for right now. It builds the best possible version of a living thing for the specific conditions of the specific moment in which that living thing exists. Meganeura was perfect for the Carboniferous. Arthropleura was perfect for the Carboniferous. And the Carboniferous and there is a melancholy in this that paleontologists rarely articulate directly. It lives between the lines of the technical literature, in the gap between the data and the description, in the moment when a researcher holds a fossil of Meganeura and knows, with a precision that laypeople rarely achieve, exactly how extraordinary the creature it represents was, and exactly how completely it is gone. But there is also something else, something that paleontology, at its best, communicates more powerfully than any other scientific discipline. Wonder. Not the manufactured wonder of entertainment, not the processed, pre-packaged astonishment of a film that tells you when to gasp and when to be amazed, but the genuine, unsteady, slightly vertiginous wonder that arrives when you truly grasp the depth of time and the strangeness of history. When you hold in your mind simultaneously the dragonfly hovering over the pond outside and the Meganeura hunting through a forest that became the coal that powered the engine that built the world you live in, and you understand that these things are connected, that you are connected to them, that the carbon in your body has been through more transformations, more geological processes, more living organisms over the past 4.5 billion years than you can begin to calculate. You are made in part of carboniferous material. The food you eat grew in soil enriched by atmospheric carbon that includes carbon dioxide exhaled by organisms that lived 300 million years ago. The oxygen in your blood has cycled through the atmosphere for billions of years, through the lungs of creatures that no longer exist, through the photosynthesis of plants that became rock, through volcanic emissions and ocean chemistry and the slow breathing of a planet that does not know it is alive, but behaves, sometimes, as if it does. You are downstream of everything that ever lived. And so is the dragonfly over the pond. The Carboniferous giants left no living descendants, but they left a world, a specific, geochemically altered, atmospherically transformed world whose coal seams and carbon deposits and isotopic signatures are woven into the fabric of everything that followed. They left trackways and sandstone that erode out of coastal cliffs 326 million years later for human beings to photograph and measure and wonder at. They left compression fossils in coal mine rock for scientists to name and study and reconstruct with tools that bend X-rays around the inside of a particle accelerator. They left questions that are still being answered. That, in the end, is what the giant insects are. They are not just a curiosity, not just a spectacular chapter in the biography of life on Earth. They are a question that the planet posed to itself 359 million years ago. How big can life get when the conditions are right? And answered, briefly and magnificently, before the conditions changed and the question became unanswerable again. We are asking the question again now, not about insects, about everything, about what life does when the conditions are right, and what it loses when the conditions change, and what survives when conditions change faster than anything can adapt. Those are not abstract questions. They are not questions confined to the Carboniferous or the Permian or the deep past. They are questions about the present, about a planet whose atmospheric chemistry is changing, whose climate is shifting, whose biodiversity is declining at rates that some researchers compare, carefully with appropriate caveats, to the rates of change associated with mass extinction events in the geological record. The comparison is contested. The science is complex. The uncertainties are genuine. But the lesson of the Carboniferous is available to anyone who wants to read it. Atmospheric chemistry matters. It sets the rule. It determines what is possible and what is not. It does not negotiate. It does not make exceptions. And when it changes, whether driven by unrotting trees or flood basalt volcanism or the combustion of fossil fuels, the living world changes with it. Not immediately, not in ways visible on the timescale of a human life or a human civilization or even a human species, but on the timescale that the rocks record, on the timescale that the fossil record preserves, on the timescale that produced Arthropleura and Meganeura, and then erased them and built a new world from the survivors. That timescale is real. It is the only timescale that ultimately matters, measured against the full biography of this planet. The giant insects knew nothing of this. They did not know the conditions that made them possible. They did not know that the oxygen would fall. They did not know that the forests would fragment, or the fungi would evolve, or the reptiles would grow agile, or the birds would come. They simply lived and hunted and reproduced and died, as all living things do, as perfectly suited to their moment as evolution could make them. They were enough. For their time, they were more than enough. They were extraordinary. And they are gone. And the stone remembers. And we are here, in a world built from their chemistry and their coal and their vanished sky, asking questions that they could not ask, and finding answers that are still incomplete and will be refined by the next discovery, and the one after that, and the one after that. For as long as there are human beings curious enough to split open a piece of coal mine rock and ask what was living when this formed. Keep asking. The stone has more to say. There is a laboratory in Grenoble, France, where the most powerful synchrotron radiation facility in Europe generates X-ray beams 300 billion times brighter than a hospital X-ray machine. The European Synchrotron Radiation Facility, the ESRF, sits in a ring-shaped building almost 300 meters in diameter, housing a particle accelerator that pushes electrons to nearly the speed of light before bending them through curves that generate, as a byproduct of that bending, X-rays of extraordinary precision and intensity. Scientists come here from around the world to look inside things, inside meteorites, inside mummified tissue, inside the teeth of ancient hominids, inside the cocoons of fossils that have spent millions of years being slowly replaced, mineral by mineral, by stone that has taken on the shape of the original biology without quite being it anymore. And inside insects. In the past 15 years, the ESRF has been used to examine Carboniferous insect fossils with a resolution that reveals structures measured in micrometers, millionths of a meter. Structures that no dissection, no conventional microscope, no previous analytical technique could have exposed without destroying the specimen in the process. The synchrotron passes its beam through the fossil and generates a three-dimensional map of density variations within the rock, variations that correspond with extraordinary fidelity to the original biological structures preserved inside. What researchers have found inside these fossils has, in some cases, confirmed what the models predicted. In other cases, it has produced surprises. A study published in the journal Science Advances in 2019 examined a series of insect fossils from Carboniferous deposits in France and Germany using synchrotron phase contrast microtomography, a mouthful of a technique name that essentially means using synchrotron X-rays to build a three-dimensional image of internal structures by detecting tiny differences in how the beam is bent as it passes through materials of different densities. The researchers were looking specifically at tracheal architecture, the internal respiratory tubes, in specimens ranging from small to large within the same geological formation, the same approximate time period, the same atmospheric conditions. What they found was a gradient. Small specimens showed compact, efficient tracheal networks occupying a modest proportion of body volume. Medium specimens showed the tracheal proportion increasing. Large specimens, the ones approaching the upper end of body size for the period, showed tracheal networks that were noticeably expanded, occupying a significantly larger proportion of internal volume, as if the respiratory system was straining to keep pace with the body around it. The largest specimens were, in a very literal anatomical sense, pushing against a wall. Their bodies were approaching the point at which the tracheal system would have needed to occupy so much space that other organ systems would have been compromised. The researchers estimated that the maximum body sizes recorded in the fossil record for this period were within perhaps 20 to 30% of the theoretical absolute ceiling, the point at which the geometry simply stops working regardless of atmospheric oxygen concentration. Which raises a question that has not been fully addressed in the literature. Were the Carboniferous giants the largest that the oxygen spike could have produced? Or were they still growing, still scaling upward, generation by generation, still not yet approaching the ceiling, when the conditions changed and the opportunity closed? We do not know. The fossil record cannot tell us whether Arthropleura and Meganeura were at their maximum possible size when the Carboniferous ended, or whether given another 10 million years of stable high oxygen conditions, they might have become even larger. The question is genuinely open. And it matters because the answer would tell us something important about whether the giants we know were the culmination of an evolutionary trajectory or merely a point along a curve that was interrupted before it reached its apex. Some researchers believe the trajectory was already flattening, that the largest known specimens were already near the practical ceiling even within the elevated oxygen environment, and that the Carboniferous giants were, in biological terms, finished products rather than works in progress. Others believe the scaling was still underway, that what we see in the fossil record is a snapshot of an ongoing experiment in size, interrupted before its conclusion.
This is the kind of question that keeps paleontologists at their desks at midnight, running models on datasets that never quite yield the resolution they need, preparing grant applications for the next synchrotron session, planning expeditions to coal basin outcrops that might contain the specimen that settles the argument. It is also the kind of question that illustrates something essential about the nature of deep time science. The fossil record is not a complete archive. It is a collection of accidents, moments when conditions happened to be right for preservation, in places where the sediment happened to have the right chemistry, in geological formations that happened to survive 300 million years of tectonic processing without being subducted or metamorphosed or eroded completely out of existence. The creatures we know about from the Carboniferous are the creatures that happened to die in the right place at the right time in front of the right sediment. The creatures that did not meet those conditions are invisible. They are gone not just in the sense that they are extinct, but in the deeper sense that they left no trace we can recover.
How many species of giant insect lived in the Carboniferous and left no fossil record? How many individual animals, Arthropleuras, Meganeura, creatures we have not yet named and perhaps never will, lived and died without being preserved? The answer is almost certainly in the millions, perhaps in the billions, across the tens of millions of years of the Carboniferous period. We see the tip of an iceberg whose full dimensions we cannot measure, and yet even the tip is astonishing. Currently, the known fauna of Carboniferous flying insects, the species formerly described and named from fossil evidence, numbers in the hundreds. Hundreds of species, many of them known from single specimens or fragmentary material, representing a diversity that was certainly vastly greater than the fossil record suggests. Insects are small. Their exoskeletons are relatively fragile compared to bone, and the conditions required to preserve them in readable form are more demanding than those required for vertebrate remains. What we have is an extraordinary gift of preservation. What we are missing is almost certainly more extraordinary still. New species continue to be described, not just from new fossil sites, but from existing museum collections, specimens that have sat in drawers for decades, collected in the 19th or early 20th century, labeled and cataloged, and then not examined in detail because the analytical tools available at the time of collection could not extract what modern techniques can. Researchers working through old collections at the Natural History Museum in London, at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, at the Smithsonian, regularly find specimens that turn out to be new to science, new species, new genera, new evidence of Carboniferous diversity that adds to the picture without completing. In 2022, a team of researchers examining material from the Mason Creek Formation at the Field Museum in Chicago identified a previously undescribed species of giant insect from specimens collected in the 1970s and never examined in sufficient detail. The specimens had been sitting in a museum drawer for 50 years. The creature they represented had been extinct for 309 million years, and it was new to science. This happens. It keeps happening. The archives of the natural history museums of the world contain almost certainly dozens or hundreds of undescribed Carboniferous insect species waiting for a researcher with the right analytical tools and sufficient time to recognize what they are looking at. The age of discovery in paleontology is not over. It has, in some respects, barely begun, because the analytical tools that make the most revealing discoveries possible have only existed for a few decades, and their application to existing collections is still in its early stages. The synchrotron facilities, the micro-CT scanners, the isotopic analysis techniques, the computational fluid dynamics modeling, the phylogenetic analysis algorithms, all of these arrived within living memory. All of them are still being refined. All of them are still producing surprises from specimens that previous researchers examined with the tools of their time and believed they understood. The stone remembers more than we have yet been able to read. There is a particular specimen at the Natural History Museum in London that is worth describing in some detail. It is a partial wing of a giant Carboniferous insect, not Meganeura specifically, but a related member of the Meganeura, the order that contained the giant dragonfly relatives of the Carboniferous and Permian. The wing fragment is approximately 40 centimeters long, representing, given its position in the wing geometry, an individual with a total wingspan of perhaps 65 to 70 centimeters. It was found in a coal measure in Yorkshire in 1931, collected by an amateur fossil hunter who donated it to the museum, and it sat in the collections for decades, examined periodically, always impressive, never fully analyzed. In 2017, a research team used high-resolution micro-CT scanning to examine the internal structure of the wing venation in 3 dimensions for the first time. What they found was unexpected. The veins of the wing were not uniform tubes. They had a variable wall thickness, thicker where structural stress would have been greatest during flight, thinner where flexibility was needed. The architecture was not random. It was, in the language of engineering, optimized. The wing had been built by evolution to handle the specific mechanical stresses of flight in a body of that size, in an atmosphere of that oxygen content, with a precision that the external surface morphology alone had never revealed. The researchers compared the structural optimization of the Carboniferous wing venation to the venation of modern dragonfly wings and found both similarities and significant differences. The similarities confirmed the evolutionary continuity of the basic dragonfly wing plan across 300 million years. The differences revealed specific adaptations to large body size, adaptations that had evolved in the Carboniferous, had served the giant insects well, and had then been eliminated from the gene pool as the giants disappeared and the lineage shrank to modern proportions. Those adaptations are gone. The genetic information that produced them is gone. The evolutionary pathway that led to them has been closed for 250 million years. But in the Yorkshire specimen, in that 40-centimeter wing fragment sitting in a museum drawer in London for 86 years before anyone looked closely enough to see what it contained, the record of those adaptations survived. Waiting. This is what paleontology actually is. Underneath the drama of the field expeditions and the excitement of the major discoveries, it is the patient, meticulous, sometimes century-long process of asking better and better questions of evidence that was laid down hundreds of millions of years ago and has been waiting, with the perfect indifference of stone, for the questions to arrive. The questions are arriving faster now than at any previous point in the history of the discipline. The tools are better, the databases are larger, the international collaboration between research groups is more extensive. The computational power available for modeling and analysis has increased by orders of magnitude in the past 20 years. The pace at which new understanding is generated from existing and new evidence is accelerating. What will the next decade produce? What will the next synchrotron session reveal from a specimen that has been in a museum collection for 100 years? What will the next coastal erosion event in Northumberland expose? What will the next split nodule from the Mazon Creek Formation show? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine predictions of scientific progress. Somewhere in the world right now, A Carboniferous insect fossil is eroding out of a rock face. Somewhere, a museum specimen is waiting for the analytical technique that will reveal what it actually contains. Somewhere, a researcher is looking at data from a synchrotron session and seeing something that does not quite fit the existing model, and beginning the slow, careful, rigorous process of figuring out what it means. The science is alive. The story is not finished. Meganeura is gone. Arthropleura is gone. The forests and the oxygen and the empty sky and the whole magnificent, temporary, accidental world of the Carboniferous is gone. But the record of that world is not gone. It is preserved in coal seams and fossil beds and museum drawers and the isotopic chemistry of ancient rock, and the humans working to read that record are doing so with tools and techniques that are improving year by year, and they are finding things that no one expected, and they are revising the picture with every major discovery, and the picture that is emerging, still incomplete, still uncertain at the edges, still full of open questions, is one of the most extraordinary things that human curiosity has ever produced. A biography of a vanished world, written in stone, being read by the creatures that inherited it. There is no better note on which to leave this story. Not because the story is over. It is not. It will not be while there are researchers asking questions and fossils waiting to answer them, but because the invitation this story extends is not to reach a conclusion. It is to develop a relationship with deep time, with the improbable contingency of the living world, with the understanding that the planet beneath your feet has hosted more worlds than you can imagine, and that each of those worlds was complete in itself, fully realized, perfectly suited to its moment, and then gone. The Carboniferous was one of those worlds. It had giant dragonflies and armored millipedes and forests that became coal, and an atmosphere that made the impossible routine. It lasted 60 million years, longer than the entire age of dinosaurs. It was not a prelude to anything. It was not a rehearsal for what came after. It was itself, complete, on its own terms, for 60 million years. And then it became the next world, and the next, and the next, until it became this one. The one where you are sitting, right now, breathing 21% oxygen, in a world built from Carboniferous coal under a sky that birds own, surrounded by flowering plants, descended from the survivors of the worst catastrophe in the history of complex life. Holding in your mind the image of a 70-centimeter dragonfly hunting through a forest that no longer exists. That image is yours now. Take care of it. It took 315 million years to get here. There is one more thing that needs to be said. One more thread that runs through everything we have covered and has not yet been pulled fully into the light. We have talked about oxygen. We have talked about forests and coal and mass extinction and the arrival of birds and the coevolution of flowers and the miniaturization of a lineage that once produced the largest flying creatures in the history of animal life. We have talked about synchrotrons and museum drawers and coastal cliffs and the patience of stone. But we have not talked about what it means to live in a world where something like Meganeura was possible and is no longer possible. What it means that the atmospheric conditions required to produce a giant flying insect have not existed on this planet for 252 million years, and are not approaching again. What it means that the ceiling on insect size is not an arbitrary biological limit, but a precise mathematical consequence of the chemistry of the air we breathe. It means the sky is permanently smaller than it once was. Not in the literal sense. The sky is the sky. The same column of gas held to the planet by the same gravitational field, reaching the same distance before thinning into vacuum. But in terms of what that sky can contain, what life forms it can support, what biological possibilities it holds open, it has been smaller since the Permian extinction closed the door on the Carboniferous world. The range of what is possible in that sky has been permanently reduced, not by a catastrophe that might be reversed, not by a temporary chemical imbalance that the planet might correct, but by the irreversible accumulation of evolutionary change. The arrival of birds, the diversification of bats, the refinement of aerial predation to a level of efficiency that makes large flying insects non-viable regardless of atmospheric oxygen, combined with the irreversible loss of the specific body plans that once inhabited the upper range of what the tracheal system could support. The sky has not been this biologically restricted since before the Carboniferous began. This is not a catastrophe. It is not a tragedy in any meaningful sense. The modern sky is not impoverished. It is extraordinary, filled with birds of bewildering diversity, with bats navigating in complete darkness using sound alone, with insects of staggering variety performing ecological functions that underpin almost every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. The modern sky is, by any reasonable measure, a biological marvel. But it is different. It is operating within boundaries that the Carboniferous sky did not recognize. And understanding that those boundaries exist, understanding how they were established, what it cost to establish them, what was lost in the process, is part of understanding what the living world actually is. Not an eternal, stable system cycling through predictable states, but a historical entity. Something that has a biography, something that is, right now, the specific product of everything that has ever happened to it, carrying the marks of every catastrophe and every opportunity and every evolutionary experiment that has ever run its course on this planet. The living world has scars. The Permian extinction is one of them. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse is one of them. The arrival of birds is not a scar. It is a gain, a new capability, a biological innovation that enriched the sky, even as it foreclosed on certain possibilities within it. The evolution of flowering plants is not a scar. It is a transformation, a rewriting of the rules that produced a different kind of richness at the cost of a different kind of possibility. Everything that lives today is the product of both the gains and the losses, of the enrichments and the foreclosures, of the extinctions and the radiations and the catastrophes and the recoveries. The living world is not the best of all possible worlds. It is not the richest possible world or the most biodiverse or the one with the most extraordinary creatures. It is this world, the specific, contingent, accident-shaped world that resulted from this particular sequence of events on this particular planet. And this world contains, among many other things, insects. Approximately 5.5 million species of them by current estimates, though the true number may be significantly higher, given how poorly surveyed many tropical and soil-dwelling insect communities remain. They make up more than half of all known animal species on Earth. Their combined biomass exceeds that of all terrestrial vertebrates combined. They pollinate roughly 80% of flowering plant species. They cycle nutrients through virtually every terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem. They serve as the primary food source for enormous numbers of birds, bats, fish, reptiles, and mammals. They decompose organic matter. They aerate soil. They control populations of other insects. They perform without awareness or intention ecological functions so numerous and so fundamental that the collapse of insect populations, which multiple large-scale studies published in the past decades suggest is already underway in many parts of the world, would destabilize food webs and ecosystem functions in ways that would cascade through the living world with consequences that are difficult to fully model and genuinely alarming to contemplate. These are not giant insects. They are not the armored giants of the Carboniferous or the aerial predators of the high-oxygen sky. They are small, overwhelmingly, extraordinarily, functionally small, because the world shaped them that way over 250 million years, and because smallness turned out to be not a limitation, but a superpower. The ability to fit into any gap, exploit any resource, adapt to any condition, reproduce in any environment, survive any catastrophe that does not eliminate every individual simultaneously. Insects have survived 5 mass extinctions. They have survived the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, the Great Dying, the end Triassic extinction, the end Cretaceous asteroid impact that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs. They have survived ice ages and volcanic winters and the radical rearrangement of continental geography. They have survived the emergence of human civilization and the agricultural transformation of terrestrial ecosystems and the introduction of synthetic pesticides and the fragmentation of natural habitats into isolated patches that bear an uncomfortable structural resemblance to anyone who knows the history, to the fragmented forests of the late Carboniferous. They are still here, in numbers and diversity that dwarf every other animal group, still occupying every ecological role that smallness and adaptability can reach. Still, in the most important biological sense, dominating the planet they have inhabited for 400 million years. The giants are gone. The domination continues. And that continuity, that 400 million year thread connecting the Carboniferous ancestors to the dragonfly over the pond, and the beetle in the soil, and the moth at the window, and the bee in the flower, is itself a kind of answer to the question this video began with. Why did giant insects disappear and never come back? Because the world changed. Because the atmosphere changed, and the predators changed, and the plants changed, and the ecological logic changed. And insects, with the evolutionary flexibility that is their deepest and most remarkable characteristic, changed with it. They did not fight the New World. They did not attempt to preserve the Carboniferous body plan in an environment that could not support it. They adapted, with the brutal efficiency of natural selection operating across millions of generations, and they became what the New World needed them to be: small, diverse, specialized, indestructible. The giant insects are gone because evolution moved on, because the same process that built them, given different inputs over a long enough timescale, builds different things. Because evolution is not loyal to its previous solutions. It is loyal only to the present, only to the conditions of the current moment, only to the question of which individuals right now are most likely to survive and reproduce. In the Carboniferous, the answer to that question sometimes involved being very large. In every moment since the Permian extinction, the answer has involved being small. That is the complete answer. Not a single cause, but an accumulation of causes: atmospheric, ecological, evolutionary, geological, each operating on its own timescale, each contributing its own pressure, all of them pushing in the same direction over a span of time that reduces any individual human life to a quantity too small to measure meaningfully. The direction they pushed was away from giants. And the insects, being what they are, went in that direction without hesitation. There is a last image I want to leave you with. Not a synchrotron facility or a museum drawer or a coastal cliff in Northumberland. Something smaller. Something alive. Find a dragonfly. Not a photograph, a real one. Go to a pond or a river or a wetland on a warm afternoon and wait. And one will come. They are everywhere. Every continent except Antarctica. Every warm season wetland in the temperate and tropical world. 4,000 known species, each one the product of the same 350 million year lineage, each one carrying in its genome the deep history of the most successful flying predator in the history of animal life. Watch it hunt. Watch the way it holds position, hovering with a precision that makes the best human engineering look clumsy. Watch the way its head moves, that slight tilt, that rapid reorientation as compound eyes that process motion faster than you can consciously perceive lock onto a target. Watch the strike, the folded legs extending, the body angling into a dive, the capture happening faster than you can follow with your eyes. 95% success rate. In 350 million years, the hunting software has not degraded. It has been refined. It is better now in some measurable computational sense than it was when Meganeura used it to catch cockroach relatives in a Carboniferous forest. Smaller, more efficient, operating in a world that has been completely rebuilt around it multiple times since the ancestors of this creature first took to the air. The body that carries that hunting software is 16 centimeters of wingspan instead of 70. It will never be 70 again. The atmosphere will not allow it. The birds will not allow it. The evolutionary history of the past 250 million years will not allow it. But the software runs. The eyes track. The strike lands. And somewhere in the genome of that small, ancient, perfect creature, in the deep evolutionary history encoded in sequences of DNA that have been copied and modified and passed forward for 350 million years, there is a memory of a larger sky, a richer air, a forest that became coal, a world that was, for a few tens of millions of years, extraordinary beyond anything that came before or after. That memory is not accessible. It cannot be read or recovered or expressed. The conditions that would allow it to be expressed no longer exist and will not exist again. But it is there, locked in the biology of a creature that survived everything the planet could throw at it by becoming something the planet's new rules could accommodate. The giant insects are gone. The insects remain. The sky is smaller than it was. The story is not over. The planet could throw at it by becoming something the planet's new rules could accommodate. The giant insects are gone. The insects remain. The sky is smaller than it was. The story is not over.